you could ask your parents or your grandparents to cook you something right now, what would you pick? Is it a plate of dumplings or some sort of fruit pie? Or maybe it's a stew that you can't get out of your head. What is this dish? What does it look like? What are some of the associated smells that come with this dish for you? From the moment it enters the room to the first few bites. What is it about this particular dish that strikes you at your core? Think about the surrounding environment. What is the environment? What is the experience that encapsulates this dish? Where does it transport you? My food memories start in Colombo, Sri Lanka. The island sun is beating down on my face as I'm sitting in this really uncomfortable fold-up chair. We're in the parking lot of the local church for an annual fundraiser, and my mom and grandma are hosting a food stand. And at this food stand, they're serving this dish called a dosa, which is this savory crepe that's made out of a fermented batter of rice and lentils. I'm 9 or 10 at the time, and my single duty is to make sure as soon as my grandma's dosa hits the plate, I quickly have to dress it with an assortment of colorful sambals and chutneys. It feels like the longest day of my life. I see all the kids playing everywhere else, and I'm stuck in this tent. It feels like a sauna next to 4 hot pans, and my mom and my grandma are just bickering all day. To be honest, I don't want to be anywhere near this tent. But through this sense of forced labor, I notice a few things throughout the day. First of all, we have the longest lineup out of any food vendor at the event, and it's snaking around the corner. And there's a sea of smiles. People would take their food, they would leave, they would eat, and then they would come back to try to talk to my mom or grandma. And then my grandma would make her way around and try to hug and kiss as many people as she could. Witnessing my grandma's ability to transform someone's mood through food was hypnotizing. If you think of nostalgia as a plane of time, think of food as a bullet train that can take you to a specific spot. We often associate food memories to people and places and specific points in our lives. And we attach deep nostalgia to some of the rituals that are associated with food memories. My mom is an excellent cook, and she learned from her mom and her grandmother. Some of my earliest food memories are helping them in some sort of menial way. Picture a large kitchen, hot. It was always hot. We're a half a dozen people. There's an auntie grinding rice to make that batter. There's another auntie in the back making some sort of fish curry, and someone else is grinding chilies for sambal. There was this symphony of sounds from the grind of that mortar and pestle to the popping and crackling of the wood fire. My aunties and my mom and my grandmas would gossip and catch up and babysit while they were cooking in this space. And over time and repetition, the food became second nature, muscle memory. There were no recipes. My mom would associate dishes to people. So if so-and-so was visiting, we would make such and such. Let's go back to that dish of yours for a second. Have you ever lost your relationship to your family's food? So this setting, I didn't realize how important this setting was until I was plucked from it. We were living in Sri Lanka in the middle of a civil war, and my parents tried to do their best to shield my sisters and myself from it, until they couldn't. So like many other families in the 80s and 90s, we left Sri Lanka and we came to Canada. I remember those first few months quite vividly. It felt like there was a mountain of stress on my parents' shoulders as they were navigating a new land, a new culture, and for some reason, nobody had quite told them how cold it gets here in Canada. We arrived on Thanksgiving Day in 1990, and it was cold back then. So my mom had a plan. Through the midst of this chaos, she wanted to create some sort of some conduit back home to the culture, and she wanted to recreate the kitchen experience to do that. So she would take my dad and myself, and we would drive throughout Scarborough looking for stores and ingredients. And I'd be sitting in the back seat just staring at this endless highway of strip malls. We'd come back home, she would relearn and recreate these traditional dishes based on what was available to her. My parents couldn't control the climate outside and the changing world around them, so they figured they need to have some sort of control over the dining experience. Suddenly now, these dishes that we would have once in a while back home were very important. They were transcendent. These dishes became ritualistic. They were equal parts nostalgia and comfort wrapped in a blanket of certainty. And in high school, I met friends that felt the same way. They would have fathers and mothers that would try to bring a faraway place a little closer. The kitchen became that portal. For us, we settled into this ritual that I like to call the Sunday Dosa experience. So every Sunday morning, I'd wake up, walk over to the kitchen, the TV would be on one side, my mom would be on the other, she'd be making something for a couple of hours, we'd be eating and catching up, just how was school? Most of the time she would be just nagging me, like, why aren't you married yet, why don't you have kids? Okay, Mom, I'm 14 years old. But this was an awesome ritual that I had for many years of my life. Have you ever lost a food ritual? And maybe you lost it when you first moved out of home. That's what happened to me. Suddenly now I didn't have those 2 hours every Sunday morning with my dad or my mom. My Sundays felt a little empty. It felt like something was different. And I'll admit, it changed me. I was out of my mom's kitchen for the first time in my life, and eventually I started traveling for work. And I was experiencing a world of food. I was exploring food, and everything was shiny and new. And I had two types of food experiences. On one hand, I'd be in a hole in the wall somewhere, eating a bowl of something that had such a direct connection to the person serving it to me. And on the other, I'd be in these pristine dining rooms with white tablecloths and 5-hour tasting menus where there was modernist this and molecular that. This juxtaposition of food in the context of past, present, and future was really seducing. It really lured me in. And I left the world of IT and I entered the arena of food writing. 25 years after leaving Sri Lanka, I was invited to go back on a culinary trip. And this changed my life. Everything that I had built in my memory bank to be so monumentous and big was suddenly just so small. From those streets to even that church. And the food had evolved too. Things that looked familiar tasted different. The food of my homeland had evolved while we were away, like it does everywhere else. On the last day of this trip, I was staring at this Yoki sun that was setting over the Indian Ocean with my feet in the sand, and I had a bit of a revelation about my mom's cooking. It was a time machine. It is a time machine. It is a lost language to food at a specific point in history. Somehow contained through immigration and her muscle memory. I had to find a way to preserve that. You know, on one hand, we look at food as a device for nostalgia, and it offers us a glimpse of the past. It can tell you where you're from, where your parents and your grandparents are from. It's a family history book, a metaphorical heirloom. And on the other, food can be a glimpse into the future. It can tell us where we're going. You know, in a world where cultural delineations are being blurred and chefs are taking one kind of cuisine and mixing it with one kind of technique to create something new. That's a transient thing, and this is a suspended thing. I saw it as a choice between emotion and science. And I leaned towards this idea of nostalgia. And I became obsessed with the idea of food possibly being a time machine. To be honest, there's no better place to do that than here. I end up in kitchens where I meet a large number of families that come from faraway places that make Canada their new home. And they bring with them these really rich traditional dishes along with them. Every loaf of bread that they bake for me and every plate of rice that they serve for me has a deep story. I firmly believe that you can measure the success of a nation's legacy by the way it adopts and preserves food and culture from somewhere else. So, what is it about this, though? Let's go back and talk about that dish. Think about that dish. Recently, I was invited to lunch by a friend of mine, and the invitation was vague. It said, "Mom's making beef noodle soup. Do you want to come?" I don't care what show you're binging on Netflix. If you get an invite like that, you go. Promise me you'll go. So I go to my friend's house, and the three of us are hanging in the kitchen. Michelle's making some tea, while her mom's staring at this really big pot, and it's blackened on the outside from years of use with dents everywhere. And she's gently stirring this pot with this enthralled look on her face. So I look to my friend Michelle, and I ask her about this dish, this soup. Why is it so special? And she says that it's a family specialty, and it's been in the family for 4 generations. And her mom used to make it regularly. Up until recently, now she makes it a couple times a year. A few seconds later, her mom puts the ladle down, and she turns to me and she said, "It's very labor intensive. It's really difficult. I only have a few pots left in me." And with that, a wave of silence just covers the room, and I could feel that their emotions were retracting from one of joy to slightly somber. To try to break the ice, I looked to my friend and I said, "Okay, but Michelle, you can help your mom. You know the soup. You've learned it." "I don't know." "You don't know it?" "I haven't learned it." And I could feel this cocktail of frustration from her, equal parts regret and guilt. This recipe had been in my friend's family for 4 generations, and I was there to taste one of the last iterations of it before it disappeared forever. So, I asked my friends and colleagues this over the years. What is that one dish that's so special to you? Why is it special? And have you taken the time to learn it? In most cases, the answer is no. And I get all kinds of excuses from, the pace of life is fast, corporate everything, life is busy, but also food's accessible. I can get anything I want whenever I want. Why do I need to learn a recipe? But if you don't learn that recipe, what about all the experiences and the social rituals and context that comes with that dish? Food is a dynamic thing, and it's constantly evolving and changing. And it does that through war, immigration, and especially through technology. Technology has probably had the biggest impact on food. In this room, technology can probably tell us where to get the best shawarma in the city. And if you're wondering, it's across the river, a 5-minute drive. In this room, technology can give you the best delivery within minutes. Convenience is a good thing, right? Convenience makes us better eaters, hopefully more conscious eaters, and hopefully we can say that convenience has allowed us to learn about our neighbors' cuisines. But there is also this idea of food becoming a symbol of status. We crave new experiences and new restaurants and new food festivals. We constantly want to try something new, and they become these notches on our belt. We want to be able to try something new and then share it with our friends and networks. If you consume enough digital media, it's really hard to not get sucked into that chase. But food isn't just about notches on your belt. The problem with new experiences is that it tends to push everything into the background. So as you're on this roller coaster to an unknown destination with quick hits of elation and excitement, what are you leaving behind as you navigate this digital space? What about the things that make up your culinary identity? Let's go back to that dish of yours. The one that your mom or dad makes fairly regularly? The one that your Nona makes regularly? How many pots does she have left in her? And when you lose that recipe, do you lose it forever? And when you lose that recipe, do you lose the social context and the experience that comes with it? There's a beauty to the idea of cooking things slowly. Sure, over time, we had to find ways to make something beautiful out of bottom-of-the-barrel ingredients, to coax flavors and textures out of something that was from odd bits and ends. But I think it was also a way for families to share one space together, to be in one room while they cook things slowly, kind of like my mom's Dosa experience every Sunday. As a food writer and traveler, I notice that recipes and rituals are falling through the cracks of our generations. for a number of reasons. It could be hardship, could be immigration, but it's also a lack of interest. Every generation has its own way of trying to find a way to work with the complex world and navigate it. But what about the things that we lose in that process? For me, what I tried to do is I tried to get around this about a decade ago, and I figured, okay, I'm going to try to learn the ancestral recipes of my parents. So I'll be honest, in the beginning, I took a very technical approach. I got my mom, we're in the kitchen, there's a GoPro over here, a camera over here, a tape recorder, a notepad. Okay, Mom, show me everything. Didn't go quite as planned. So my mom has never written any recipe down, and she has a really interesting way of measuring things. So we start with measurements, because when you're cooking, you want measurements. And she'll use her fingers to start pinching, and she'll draw circles on her hands to give me portions. We'd be staring at a bowl, something's boiling in this bowl, and I'd ask my mom, Mommy, how do you know when that's done? Oh, look, no, it's done. That's how you know it's done. No, Mom. So after a decade of trying to do this, I realized that it's actually not about the recipe at all. My mom's food tastes very different from mine, because as soon as she hands that recipe over to me, it evolves and changes. The way I shop is different. The way I prep is different. My hands are different. So my ritual now is to figure out some way to encapsulate the mom experience, just the time that you spend in the kitchen. I was speaking to my friend Michelle recently, and she admitted to me that she was afraid of her mom's mortality, that her family food was attached to the mortality, and she didn't want to address that. If you understand and accept that your mom's cooking is finite, I think you can then decide whether you want to preserve some or all of it. I know that when I spend time with my mom, the majority of time is in the kitchen. She's grinding coconut, I'm cutting eggplant. The food is still the soundtrack in that space. And the soundtrack has evolved over the years, and it's different, but it still furnishes the space that we try to create. I don't know how many pots my mom has left in her, but I know it's a fixed amount. So in my head, there's a race to try to immortalize whatever I can, especially immortalize what has made her her, and also what has made me into the person I am today because of that. We need to do that. We need to work on that habit before it's too late. Spend some time with your mom and get to know her, get to understand what makes her her. Whether it's a latke, or whether it's a soup, or whether it's a beautiful loaf of banana bread. Do it before it's late. Spend some time in your family kitchen to see if you can absorb some of that ancestral wisdom, whether it's through the recipe, the technique, or the ritual. Thank you.